So let's see if I can break this some more. No. Hi, thank you all for coming this afternoon here. So Ken asked me to cover a couple of topics here. He said, talk about new standards that will make a difference. And given that we are at the SVG Summit, I want to grab basically, I could be up here all day. I mean, there's 20 or 30 new standards that are out there that are really important to this sporting and sports industry. But I think HDR and all IP really have impact, particularly in the production side, a lot more than the others. And for my only, shall we say, commercial statement here, for those that have never heard of Mediažind, I understand. It's Ericsson Media Solutions. We're spinning off from Ericsson in a few weeks, so we're formerly known as Mediažind. So that's it. Everything else is technology. So let us remind ourselves of one thing, and I think it's really important. When we talk about HDR, people are starting to forget this already. It is not about getting a brighter display. It is not about delivering brighter pictures. If we wanted to do that, we have a gain control on a television or on the production equipment, which we could just crank, as our famous Spinal Tap people would say, mine goes up to 11, you know, type of thing. That it's not about brighter pictures. What it is about is the difference between the darkest elements that you could see in the shadows and the brightest elements that you can discern simultaneously at the same time. In other words, it looks like what the human visual system can see. We got used to this when we're watching television. We're just used to it. And you don't understand just how much, and this is a different use of the word compressed. It's not video compressed. It's the dynamic range is compressed on a television. And you just watch it as TV. Then you go outside in real life and you relate the two. But the fact of the matter is, watching television looks very different than live outside, for instance. So to remind ourselves about this, it's really important to understand that with most video, so in television, the difference between, say, the average white level or the diffuse white, which I show on this automobile here in the white paint with no reflections on it, and a highlight or a specular highlight, which is the sun reflecting off that same car, which is labeled as a specular on here, is only about 25%. In other words, it's only 1.25 to 1. Where in the real world, this would be 1,000,000 or 1,000,000,000 to 1 if you're reflecting light. Ever walk through a parking lot on a summer day and you squint your eyes because the lights reflect off that? Or you're at the beach and you're looking at the water, same type of thing. The reflected lights are so bright. At the same time, you'd like to be able to see details in the shadows, in the dark areas around where the tires are around there. See the tire tread at the same time. That's the dynamic range that we're talking about here. And with HDR, while it emulates the real outdoors, it's only about 100 to 1, but that certainly gives you a much more immersive viewing experience than you have now, which is basically a flat plane of fully compressed pictures. The other thing to keep in mind when you talk about high dynamic range, we colloquially call everything high dynamic range. It's actually a combination of 3 different technologies. It's the actual high dynamic range transfer function itself. That's the conversion of light to a bit stream or a bit stream back to light. Also, a color gamut, in this case, a wide color gamut over that. And the last thing is, you know, when you convert things from analog to digital, everything is done in terms of a coefficient, right, in the equation, or a mantissa, a portion of that. And what we've gotten used to now is pretty much everything we have until recently, if it's consumer grade, it's 8 bits. All your television displayed is 8-bit video, everything's 8-bit. If you do the math on that, that means there's only roughly about 250 different levels you can have. So I don't know what you can see in the back of the room there, but you should be able to see visible banding in the evening sunset there on the left. Can you see that in the back? That is not due to video compression. That is due to not having enough bits of information. You only have 250 different levels. You normally don't notice it unless you have slow moving or flat gradients, which is very slow changing. So slow in brightness here, which would be the dynamic range, and slow in color, which would be the hue on that. So what we have here now, of course, is extended sampling bit depth. In this case, it's 10 bits to kind of smooth all that out. So it's a combination, and when we say HDR, we really mean HDR plus wide color gamut plus 10-bit sampling. And the most important thing to realize about this is completely independent of the spatial resolution. So in other words, the picture on the left there, on the lower left there, that's 3840 by 2160. That's what we call 4K television. It doesn't matter whether it's 4K or full HD, which is a 1920 by 1080. HDR, in this case, the HDR plus WCG plus 10-bit, applies equally as well to HD. And this is a very important point because for those that have bandwidth issues, which we'll talk about a little bit later, you can do a lot more with HD than you can do with 4K in an existing plant. So it's something to keep in mind. Now let's look at that color space a little bit. Now, of course, I think most people realize we see three primary colors for television: red, green, and blue. And if we take red, green, and blue and we put it into a two-dimensional XY space, that's the chromaticity chart on the left, then what happens is red, green, and blue are 3 points in that space. Each one is a doublet on that, and the points in that. So that forms a triangle. The human visual system can resolve everything you see in that basically bullet-shaped oblong diagram up there, okay? HD television, what we think is great to watch every day, that's the orange triangle, which means those signs that you see on the highway, that green, that's not in the color space. The brake lights on your car, the red, it's not in the color space of HD. So it gets become muted. It doesn't look as real. Now you don't, again, because we're used to watching television, we don't notice that shift. But you would if you were able to look at that on display and look at the real event happening in life. So it's a combination of having the wider color space with the higher dynamic range at the same time being able to see that dynamic range difference. And that's what I'm representing. So I'm going to take that XY chart there and I'm going to lay it down flat. You can see it in the bottom, okay? And then I'm going to have a Z dimension added to that. That's the high dynamic range aspect of it. So we get the wider color volume, the wider color space and the Z dimension. That forms what is known as a color volume. It's a three-dimensional color volume. And I hope you can see that HD's color volume is that smaller on the inside, and the larger geometric shape on the outside, that's 4K. Excuse me, now I just did it. Forget what I just said, let's roll back. That's HDR versus SDR in the same resolution. Sorry about that. It's been a long day trying to fix this thing to work right, and I just got myself messed up. So with that in mind, I want to point something out. You can see how much larger the color volume is for high dynamic range, right? Anything weird about this chart or strange about this chart? X and Y are linear. Z is log. So actually, if this was a linear in the Z dimension, it'd be 5 or 6 stories high. Now do you see the difference with high dynamic range versus what we have today? It really is a huge different viewing experience. And why am I talking about color volumes? Because I talk about color volumes because all of the HDR standards involve doing something with a color volume. Each HDR display is out there, different manufacturer, different technologies. Some might be LED lit LCD panels, other ones might be OLEDs, for instance. We have new ones that are coming out that are variations of quantum crystalline structures like quantum dots that are coming out. They all have different technologies, and because it's produced differently, they all have different results, which means what one HDR display can make from one manufacturer and what another one can display or render is different. Okay, how does that affect you guys? Because you're mastering it in one format, but every display is going to look different. So we have to do something known as color volume mapping, which is basically use the color volume that was in that the display can display and basically convert what the incoming signal is to that. That's called color volume mapping. It has both tone mapping, which is intensity, that's the brightness level and the darkness level, and gamut mapping, which is the color. You actually have to move it within the triangle. So it's a 3D color mapping thing on that. So with this in mind, every time we talk about all these different HDR schemes, we're talking about doing color volume mapping to meet what each individual display is. By the way, I guess I should point out, even in a single manufacturer that makes displays, the color volumes could be different on them, on the display, based on how much money they wanted to put into the display. They might take shortcuts, and some could be better than another. The other thing is, you hear a lot about peak white levels in HDR display. A typical non-HDR display today that you can buy, so regular SDR, I guess we would call it, then is about 300 to 400 nits or candelas per square meter. The minimum display, if it's LCD technology that you usually can find, that is HDR, has a peak white level of 1,000 to 1,500 nits. The production for SDR is 100 nits. So at 1,000 nits, you're already 10 times that, and then the black level goes 10 times the other way, lower, which is why you have 100 to 1 as your contrast ratio difference between that. So at the end of the day, you probably have, particularly with an OLED TV, you could have millions and millions of to 1 for the contrast ratio. That's why OLEDs look so brilliant and great in a darker room, because they're not as bright. They got great blacks. So with that in mind, there are a whole bunch of HDR systems. We would love, in the issue of standards, I'm on my political soapbox here as a 30-year veteran of doing standards in the television industry. The industry has failed you guys. We have 6 or 7 major HDR systems that are all different out there. So we've reached a day for the political correctness of, if you submitted a system, you got a trophy. Everybody won. So what are we going to do now? Well, at least we could do is explain what we have to help you guys work through that. And there are some sessions that were held early this morning that I was sitting in, as well as some later on this afternoon, that talk a little bit what do we do with this technology. So the simplest form behind this are something known as these 3 systems here. These are static HDR systems. What I mean by static is their color volumes don't change based on scene. That you set them once and they're done. And the 3 systems are commonly known as PQ10, HDR10, and HLG10. You might have heard of these things. PQ, it stands for Perceptual Quantizer. It is a SMPTE standard for this, and that's the transfer function that converts between linear light to a bit stream and back. And it is a combination of that. Remember, HDR is 3 things. So it's a combination of the HDR transfer function, the wide color gamut, which is in BT 2020, and also 10-bit sample bit depth. HDR10 is the exact same thing as PQ10 with one addition to it. It has static metadata that gets sent along in the bit stream to help the received device figure out what it has as far as the brightness, the darkness, and the mid-tone levels, whatever's in there. Basically, it's telling you about the content you have. I want to point out it is descriptive. It doesn't tell the display what to do. It tells the display what you're sending to it. It's the light levels you're sending to it. And that's really the only thing that HDR10 adds, is that reference display metadata. This was, it's standardized, again, and it's a SMPTE standard, SMPTE ST 2086, but it really came in from, the industry, Blu-ray Disc Association, Digital Entertainment, the studios went this in order to be able to have some type of regularity to be able to help these displays do their color volume mapping. And it's simple in the fact that it's static, it doesn't change for the set of content. The other one, which is completely different, is a different way of looking at this. It's known as HLG10. HLG stands for hybrid log gamma. I would take a whole hour just to explain the transfer functions, but suffice it to say it's a different HDR transfer function from PQ, and instead of using absolute light levels to measure it, it uses relative light levels. It's a different way of doing it. It's become pretty popular lately to be used in live production because it has absolutely no metadata associated with it at all, and therefore any of the issues you might have in carrying metadata through your system aren't there. There are trade-offs, though. Again, if I had more time, I'd show this to you. There are huge trade-offs between whether you use PQ and HLG. Each has its application, which is why there's 2 systems. Now let's make things more complicated. Remember I told you it's all about the light and mapping. Well, wouldn't you get a much better job of that if you could change it per scene? You could actually change it per frame, but typically it makes more sense to change it per scene. And these are called dynamic adaptive metadata systems. So it's basically starts with the PQ10 again, and instead it adds frame by frame or scene by scene display adaptation metadata. And there are several systems that are described in a suite of standards known as SMPTE Standard 2094, which describes dynamic metadata and how it's being used. Very important elements for live production are deep shadow, the minimum black levels you have, so you can actually discern the differences in the deep shadows, mid-tones, facial and interior like we have here, and like specular highlights, the maximum stuff for that. Again, the overall brightness is not really anything much more than you have in your regular televisions today. It's the spread of that. Right, it's the difference between the lowest lows and the highest highs, but the average light level, the mid-tones, is pretty much the same as we have today. So along the lines of that, you might have heard of a couple of these. Dolby Vision, Samsung HDR10 Plus, and Philips Technicolor SL-HDR1. So there are 3 other systems. Again, they're not compatible with each other. They do it in different ways. Dolby Vision and Samsung HDR10 Plus also use descriptive metadata, sort of like HDR10 does, but remember, it's dynamic, so it's changing per scene or per frame, whereas with HDR10, it's static. And sometimes if you get something like a Blu-ray disc or you download content that's in HDR, you'll actually get a combination of HDR10 for static, for a wider compatibility, and one of these dynamic metadata systems for them. The one thing I'd like to point out to you a little bit different is the Philips Technicolor system, SL-HDR1, works a little differently. What it's done, instead of being descriptive metadata telling you what you have, it's actually prescriptive metadata. It tells the display how to recover the HDR. The original intent of SL-HDR1 was you produce an HDR, you do a conversion factor with SL-HDR1, it converts it back to SDR, both color and in brightness, and then it has this prescriptive metadata that goes along with it. If it gets received by an SDR TV, then it will just display it. If it's an HDR TV, if that HDR TV understands how to use that prescriptive metadata, it can restore it back to HDR. It was for a backwards compatibility reasons for doing it, but you have to use it to recover the original HDR color volume. So if the display doesn't understand it, you don't get it. And full disclosure, many displays, at least as of right now, do not support SL-HDR1. And there's a debate going on whether it's truly backwards compatible or not. But the big issue here is not really to disparage SL-HDR1, is to show that I've just described to you 6 different incompatible HDR systems that we all are going to have to deal with in our production. So here's one of the areas that we have to make sure that we do. If we're going to shoot something, we usually go through a contribution or a backhaul or front haul stage. Some production work's done on it. Then we have primary distribution, when we get it from the content owner out to a final emissions type of location. Could be a television station, could be an internet service provider, whatever it is, and then you go to an emissions point. So you have contribution, distribution, emission, and the metadata and signaling has to go all the way through this. So with baseband SDI and with SDI and IP, that's ST 2022-6 for those that know, the signaling is carried in what is known as the payload ID. And each version of SDI has a different standard that goes with it. I just happen to mention it all on here. I'll make the slide deck available. I don't know how SVG will distribute it, but I'm sure they'll figure out a way. The metadata itself is carried using a relatively new SMPTE standard. Actually, it's in the final throes. It actually hasn't been published yet, which is ST 2108, and that comes in 2 parts. One that carries it in the VANC area for direct use. The other one has it as a key length value, one done for production side of that. In the new SMPTE standard 2110, which has been a subject of this morning and this afternoon, which is professional media over IP, you take the 2108 metadata and you actually carry it in 2110-40 transport. So there's actually a mechanism for doing this in 2110. So as far as transporting this signaling and metadata, we have it covered, whether it's SDI, 2022-6 SDI and IP, or ST 2110 Pro Media over IP. We have it covered. And on the consumer side, let's make these standards more complicated now that I've bored you all so far with those details. I hope you've heard of HDMI and the HDMI Forum. In the Consumer Technology Association, it's known as CTA 861. In the -G version, which is in an HDMI cable, is a minimum 2.0B. It supports all these different signalings and metadata types. So now we have the professional side on the left and the consumer side on the right. And then in the compressed domain, in order to be able to carry HDR well, you really need that 10 bits. And there's only one format that carries 10 bits that's widely distributed today, and that's high efficiency video coding, HEVC, and it's something known as a main 10 profile. And the signaling is carried in video user usability information messages, and the metadata is carried in supplemental enhancement information messages within that. And as I mentioned before, the contents of these messages are different, and the mapping of the messages are different, and there's no coordination of all this. So it's something that we in the industry have to really deal with us on this. And one of the other things we need to think about, and this has nothing to do with the different formats itself, it has to do with just how we do things. Remember going back 15, 20 years ago, we're all dating ourselves now, or at least I am. when we first went from SD to HD. Remember all the issues we had where you'd have a one HD program, or maybe it was an HD program, but the commercials that were in it were still SD type of thing? And what happens to televisions when you switch between those modes? Some of them would freeze up or they have the wrong aspect ratio. And maybe you guys have all forgotten, but it was a pretty bad scene at the time doing that, where we're going to have the same problem if you mix standard dynamic range material in with high dynamic range material. You have to adjust that color volume. Remember the color volume I showed you? The SDR color volume is smaller. You just can't display it on an HDR display. It'll get expanded wrong. It'll either be too bright, too dark, or be the wrong color space for that. And early HDR live TV, like early HD TV was earlier, is going to be a lot of mix between standard dynamic range content and high dynamic range content. And you have to be able to correct all that for doing it. So while you can't create HDR from SDR, you can balance it out and basically literally move that point in three-dimensional space from the smaller color volume I showed for SDR to that higher color volume. By moving it, it'll be rendered correctly by an HDR display. This process, if it's done in real time, is known as real-time intelligent inverse tone mapping, and it'll become part of your workflows for doing that. I think some of the sessions later on today might be discussing it, they might not be. Let me show you why tone mapping matters. Now, keep in mind that I had to emulate this because this is an SDR display, and this is a standard narrow color gamut, right? So it's not a wide color gamut, it's a standard dynamic range display, so I'm emulating it here. But if we have the main content, and of course, I'm showing it as one frame here, right? But you know, there's lots of frames of video going on here. And then we go to the first interstitial, which is a commercial, which is an SDR. Then we have a second commercial break, which is an SDR. And then we go back to the main content in HDR. This all looks fine, right? Well, it looks fine until you see it the way it should look. So I hope you can see the difference. Look at the tone on the woman's face. It's completely wrong in the upper one. It's wrong skin tone, wrong color. More importantly, you have an advertiser who's paying to do this, and their colors are wrong. That's not the Coca-Cola red. The Coca-Cola red is down below. And I hope this is why it's so important. I didn't make it HDR. It's still SDR. I just need to move the point into the right place in that HDR space. That's why I wanted to show you that color volume, so you can actually envision a point in an SDR space being moved to the right point in the wider space, how it being spread out. And that's what inverse tone mapping does. It's very, very important. So here's the big one I alluded to earlier. So that's great. Well, that's great. We'll have to have 4K and HDR. No, you don't. And this is a big thing. HDR is completely independent of spatial resolution. When you go from HD or full HD to 4K, it's in the uncompressed domain, it's at least 4 times the bit rate, which means if you, for instance, if you're in a 3 gig plant, you're gonna have to go to a 12 gig plant in order to do this. Big, huge change. But what if you could keep that 3 gig plant that you already have, or in the truck, but still carry HDR? You can. And this is known as 1080p HDR. So it's really what I call the best bang for the bit, because you get all the benefit of the color gamut and the high dynamic range. You just don't have the spatial resolution for that. And I know a few people saying, well, that could be a big deal though, it won't look as real. Yes, but pretty much, I shouldn't say pretty much, pretty definitely 100% of all 4K TVs that are out there can upconvert 1080p locally within the display with really good electronics. That's how far electronics have come. Not if it's interlaced, not 1080i, but if it's 720p or 1080p, they can upconvert that to 2160p, which is 4K, and do a really good job of it. The other big thing is, if HDR you can see from pretty far viewing distance away from the display. If you're looking at a 4K TV, you have to be 1.5 picture heights back from that display. So if this was a 4K television here, look at the height of that screen. We're going to go out from that screen 1.5 distance, which will put us somewhere around the first row. Congratulations, you're the only one in the room that can see 4K. If I then go another 1.5 screens, which goes out to about the 5th row, congratulations, you can see HD. If you go further back, you guys aren't resolving it. I can make it bigger, but you're not resolving the resolution. So in most people's homes, unless they're going to get like an 85-inch display, Most people sit in the US anyway, roughly between 9 and 10 feet back from the display. And if you do the math on this, you're going to need about an 80-inch diagonal display minimum in order to see 4K. So what happens is, in many cases, if you use 1080p, you upconvert to 4K, you really won't notice that much of a difference. But if it's HDR, you are going to notice that dynamic range difference in the better color space, because your eye is not is much more sensitive to that over distance versus spatial resolution. So you can take advantage of all the modern display's ability to upconvert 1080p, get the best bang for the bit, and actually you can broadcast in 1080p 50/60 in HDR. Now, you can't really call it true 4K, but it is ultra high definition. It's just a different definition of that. And that's why the Ultra HD forum defines 1080p HDR as an Ultra HD format, even though it's 1080p, which is full HD resolution. So I guess that little, and I know there's a session later on today that's talking about 1080p, so you'll get more information on that. Now, switching gears a bit, why are we going all IP? SDI works great. We finally got it settled after 20 years. We got very stable equipment. You can go in a truck, in a production facility, anywhere, and you can use SDI, and it's just wonderful to use it that way. We finally have stable digital television, right? Well, because we want to enhance the flexibility and the agility of the video plant. And we have many problems with SDI, but one of them is every time you change a cable size or a bit rate, you have to change cable sizes. And sometimes you can't even run cable, you have to run fiber. And there's a different standard for each one, and it's unidirectional. And by the way, it only carries one, when I say video here, I mean video, audio, and associated data. One video in that wire. So if you're sitting there switching between 500 sources, you have 500 SDI cable. Whether it's SD, HDI, HD, or 3G or 12G, depending on whether it's full HD or 4K. So we really need something that's much more dense, it's bidirectional, and it's agnostic to the video format. So we really want to be able to do this. And in general, with us moving towards a new model where everything is moving from dedicated hardware to virtualized software running on either COTS or modified COTS hardware, then we really want something that's going to go into that new model so you can virtualize that. So as a practical example of that, for those few of you that might have been at the IP Production Summit in May earlier this year, I showed this slide. And so this is basically inside a truck. This is an outside broadcast truck that can support 32 4K cameras, 12 replay servers, and the multi-viewing is present to support at least 500 unique sources. In order to do that, there's 4 racks, each rack 37 rack units high, and all that purple wiring in there, each one of those is an individual 3G SDI cable. Now, so there's 4 3G SDI cables for each 4K signal tied together, right? Looks beautiful, big rack. You're in a truck. What's that mean? You need space, it weighs a lot, you have to have power to run all this, and then you have to cool it, and you're running on gasoline. So you can see all those things running together, and if you have an outside generator, it can help you as well. But my point is, it's a lot of weight, and it's a big size. By switching over to, instead of an SDI switch, to an all-IP switch based on SMPTE standard 2110, this same exact system can be supported with one rack that's 10 rack units high with an SDI, with a 2110 IP switch in the middle of it instead of a SDI switch. So I hope you can physically see the difference just in this. Much lower weight, much lower power it takes to run it, lower sizing, lower fuel spent to cool it and everything else. But that's, of course, not the only reason why you do it. You're doing it because we want to convert to a software workflow. Another way to express this is it's not like going from analog to digital to all IP. What this most closely represents in my mind, and the way I explain it to people when I explain why we go into all IP. Remember in the day when we all used tapes, we weren't using files. First thing, big problem, it's a physical tape, it's a physical unit, so you have to go get it. Okay, we use modern technology to get around that by having tape robots, right? And movers. We can actually address it using a computer, get a physical thing and actually move the tape, but it was still a tape. Linear access to the tape. Everything was on the tape. If you wanted to dub, you needed another tape. If you wanted to move things in and out, right? Plus you had to store it. And it was big. Then we converted to files. The big thing about being files wasn't just the lighter weight and lighter size, it's you could get random access to it, and all of a sudden, all the IT tools that are out there, you can now use to access the information on that file. So it's not just about having a virtual tape being a file, it's the fact that you can do so much more in the software domain to access stuff randomly into that file than you could do anything you could do in a physical tape. The same is true by converting from SDI to all IP. You now have individually can address each stream. You don't have to have specialized embedders and de-embedders to work with it, and all the software tools you can have out there. So this is much bigger than just about reducing size and weight and power. So the status of this is the SMPTE standard 2110 for all IP. We always love to say it's completely done, but you know, we keep adding new things to it. So as of October this year, this is actually, as of now, this is the status, but the last one to be added to this got added, published in September, October timeframe. The ones inside here are the published versions of this, of 2110, which includes system timing and definitions, uncompressed video, PCM audio, all the ancillary data formats that we were talking about before. This is where your metadata for your HDR gets carried, one thing. Traffic shaping of that, because you're going to feed it in. You want to make sure you get live 24/7 video. And of course, we just added in something now, you can do AES-3, which includes more than just audio, transparent transport. And you would think we were done, but we actually have new stuff that's happening now. It's not just for uncompressed anymore. We're actually going to use 2110 for lightly compressed video. And this is a future draft that's not quite done yet. It's going to support multiple formats of compressed video. For instance, just naming some, you know, JPEG 2000, you have low latency video coding, you have SMPTE VC2, Dirac Pro, there's TICO, there's a whole bunch. And eventually anybody can come in, because what this is a generic wrapper, you can have it in there. So this would allow you to, in the new JPEG XF was the one I left out. And you can see you can wrap all this together. And why? Because we want to make sure that in the cases where you need lightly compressed, you don't, to save bandwidth, it has a way of doing that. Everything else is the same. So instead of having 36 SDI standards, we have one set of 2110 standards that can do all this. A couple more things. What if you can't fit that video signal into one cable? Even though IP cables are pretty good, some of them, what if you only have 10 gigabits per second and you want to do a 4K or an 8K signal in that, right? You're going to have to have basically a single video essence spread across multiple different 2110 streams. So that's a recommended practice that's being worked on right now. In addition to the regular ancillary data that we knew that was in the VANC or the HANC, our vertical ancillary data and horizontal ancillary data, we're now going to have something that will be coming out soon known as fast metadata, which is any generic form of metadata can be carried in it, and these standards are going to be coming out soon. So you can see it's very lively, but all the foundation standards are done for this, and it's really pretty exciting to see all this stuff come. Now, just because the standards are done, as you know, you're going to hear people talking about this. I did this morning, and you'll hear it this afternoon. Interoperability still is a lot of work to do to get things to work together, and we're still in the throes of that, but at least you can have the foundation standards are complete. Now, related to this, I do want to mention two other things that are not part of 2110, though, that I think are very important to the industry here, and one of those is 2022-8, which is actually the carriage or the timing of 2022-6. That's SDI over IP, remember? SDI over IP streams, but using that in a 2110 system. So now it's a great way to have a gateway where you can actually bridge SDI over IP into an all IP system, and that's what 2022-8 does. And that's going to be sent out to draft publication soon. So it's almost done. And then I wanted to make another mention for those that are doing seamless or hitless protection switching right now. We have two SDI over IP streams coming in, and you're doing ST 2022-7 to switch between them seamlessly, no video glitches, and goes exactly at the video switching point. Well, they're extending that standard now to be able to be generic to all IP. So basically all the ST 2110 RTP payloads are included in that. Now you can kind of already do it anyways. A few things had to be cleaned up, but the standard was actually more powerful than people realized. It didn't have to be limited to SDI over IP, but this makes it clearer. And there's actually something that's being added for an even ultra-low skew class of devices to add that in for the seamless switching, so you can do switching even in more tightly timing on that. And this is to be sent into what we call the last stage, which is this standards committee audit. So the standard's done, it's just getting reviewed to make sure that it's following convention, it doesn't, all the references are done correctly, it uses the correct SMPTE format for standard. So these are almost coming out now, which is really good. And just to remind everybody that we're leveraging off of why can we do all this all in one standard, is because instead of inventing like SDI, where you invent something right down at the physical layer, whether it's fiber or copper, and then you have the data link layer above it, and then you have all the stuff through. Instead, we're leveraging off of IEEE and IETF standards for 2110. And this diagram ties it in nicely. We have the fiber, copper, and the venerable Ethernet, IEEE 802.3, which is the underpinnings for all of this. And then, of course, we have the Internet Engineering Task Force standards. We've heard of IP, right? Maybe you didn't realize it's RFC 791, is Internet Protocol. And then you have RTP, which is the Real-Time Transport Protocol, over the User Datagram Protocol into that. Those are all IETF. And SMPTE Standard 2110 series rides on top of that. So you're not reinventing the wheel all the way down, you're leveraging off of the information technology industry, which is why we're able to do these things. Which basically means, again, no specialized embedders and de-embedders. You can have individual access to each SN stream to do this. And it also allows us to have it out faster. Just to give a more visual look for that, in SMPTE Standard 2022-6, where it's SDI and IP, I hope you can see in the left-hand side here that you have the SDI riding inside IP. Literally, the framing of SDI is riding inside the IP connection. So it's inside an RTP packet. So that means when you point to point, you're in IP, but as soon as you get to that end, what do you have? SDI. So you still need to have embedders and de-embedders in an SDI plant, SDI switch, which is fine if that's the system you're using. Whereas with 2110, it's all essence-based encapsulation. There is no SDI layer. They're all individually addressed using standard addressing tools that you use for the internet. You've heard of an IP address, or you can use a multicast address, so you can actually address right at the essence for that. And again, leverage off of the IT tools. I would be remiss if I didn't end with this, which is it's not just about the transport of the data layer. We actually have to all convert over. Transformation involves control and management as well. So IT transformation that has this flexibility, you actually have to be able to use all the IP tools and use smarter networking mechanisms for doing that. I hope most of you by now have heard of software-defined networking or network function virtualization. NFN and SDN are what allow us to be able to write code or software that runs off of mostly, not all, there's exceptions to this, commercial off-the-shelf hardware, and be able to abstract it out so you're writing things in code and software. We like to do the same thing here for 2110 series stuff, which is the software-defined media processing. Separate protocols, control planes, you define the connections from the data plane, which is the traffic carriers that we just talked about, and then you can have standard interfaces that can do that. And that work is being done by the Advanced Media Workflow Association in the Network Media Open Specifications. And they're much more set up like a network media incubator where people can work together. Uses GitHub to share the documents, and they get updated a little bit different. It's a little bit different than a due process standards body, but the concept is get it out there for people to use and then interact in the community in order to make it work. The three that are out right now, they're in active use, are discovery and registration, connection management, and network control. And again, that's AMWA, NMOS, and there'll be implementation specification, IS 04, 05, and 06. And this all follows along in the same architectures. So, is this real or is it not real? Well, for a couple of years now, we've been doing these interops at the major trade shows. The last major interop at IBC had over 50 vendors, many of whom are in this room here, showing interoperability, including, for the first time, the IBC's actual in-house television or broadcast studio was all done in ST 2110. So yes, it is real. Yes, you can do it. Yes, just like with SDI and going from analog to digital to begin with, there are always gotchas and there's some interoperability stuff, and people are talking about getting together. You heard some of those things earlier today, like security and stuff when you're on an IP network. But the good news is it is real, and it's time to do this. And these new standard sets, HDR and all IP are really exciting in our business as we move forward, and I hope you found my talk interesting. Thank you very much.